The 5th century of the Christian Church was witness to two of the largest and longest-lasting schisms in the history of the Church, schisms which persist to this day. The 5th century also saw the sowing of the seeds of a schism that would come much later, but would have devastating effects for Christendom. The great Christological crisis of the 5th century, the crisis which would lead to these two great schisms, began in the year 428. That year, a man named Nestorius, a theologian originally from the city of Antioch, was made Patriarch of Constantinople. Beginning on Christmas Day of that year, he began a series of sermons in which he denounced and condemned the practice of referring to the Virgin Mary as Theotokos, a Greek term literally meaning God-bearer, but often and appropriately translated as Mother of God. Nestorius said that the Virgin Mary could only be called Christotokos, or Mother of Christ, because she was the mother only of his human nature and not of his divine nature. Other Christians quickly stepped up to defend the use of the title Theotokos against Nestorius' assault. Nestorius' most notable opponent was St. Cyril of Alexandria, the Pope of Alexandria. St. Cyril contended that Nestorius was so far separating the human and divine natures in Christ that he was essentially positing two distinct agencies, God the Word and the man Jesus of Nazareth. In 431, an ecumenical council was called at Ephesus to resolve the dispute. The council ruled in favor of St. Cyril, endorsed the use of the title Theotokos for the Virgin Mary, and ruled against Nestorius. Nestorius was deposed from his position as Patriarch of Constantinople and sent into exile in Egypt. However, others continued his cause, especially amongst the church in Persia. This church, whose modern-day descendant is the Assyrian Church of the East based in Iraq, would at one point in history spread its Nestorian version of Christianity far into the heart of Asia, establishing churches in Tibet, India, and even China. But we'll see all of that in a later video. Shortly after St. Cyril's death, a priest and abbot from Constantinople named Eutyches began teaching an extreme version and a terrible misunderstanding of what St. Cyril had taught. Eutyches went the complete opposite direction from the Nestorians and posited that Christ's human and divine natures had in fact become a single nature in the Incarnation. Eutyches summarized his own position by saying that he believed the humanity of Christ had been swallowed up by his divinity like a drop of honey in the sea. Thus the heresy of Monophysitism was born. Another ecumenical council was called in 451, this time at Chalcedon, to address this new heresy. Eutyches was condemned as a heretic, and the Pope of Alexandria, Dioscorus, was deposed and exiled for having supported Eutyches, although he himself was not condemned as a heretic. The council declared that there are two natures in Christ, human and divine, and that he has these two natures inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. As a result of this council's decisions, there was a major upheaval in many parts of the church, especially in Egypt, where the decision was viewed as a betrayal of St. Cyril. Eventually, in the 6th century, a large portion of the church, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, would schism and form their own church. Meanwhile, in the western half of the Roman Empire, St. Augustine of Hippo, the Bishop of Hippo, was fighting against another heresy called Pelagianism. Pelagius, a monk from Britain, had begun teaching that the fall of Adam had not in fact done harm to the nature of man, as the Church taught, but had only set a bad example for the rest of mankind. St. Augustine stood up and fought against this heresy, eventually having it condemned at a local African church council held in Carthage in 418. Unfortunately, in the process of combating Pelagianism, St. Augustine adopted the opposite extreme from his opponents, holding that mankind had been almost completely corrupted by Adam's sin, and in fact shared in the guilt for his sin. He thereby invented the doctrine of original sin, and inadvertently sowed the seeds of the Great Schism, in which the Pope of Rome would tear apart from the rest of the Church. The belief in the doctrine of original sin would come to permeate the entire Church in Western Europe, and eventually would be a major contributing factor to the largest schism in Church history. But that schism wouldn't happen officially for another 600 years. As terrible as all of these schisms and seeds of schisms were, the 5th century was not entirely terrible for the Christian Church. At the same time that the bishops and other Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor were battling the heresies of Nestorianism and Monophysitism, and Augustine was battling the heresy of Pelagianism in Africa and Rome, the Church continued to spread in the far west and north of Europe. St. Patrick of Ireland brought Christianity to the Irish, becoming Bishop of all Ireland in 432. He baptized thousands of Irish into the Christian Church, establishing a church whose unique Celtic character would inspire some of the greatest feats of asceticism, some of the most beautiful poetry, and some of the longest-lasting traditions of the Christian Church. Christianity also spread to France at this time, as King Clovis I accepted the faith and underwent baptism in 493, bringing his Frankish kingdom into the Christian Church. At the same time that the Church was fracturing to its east, it was experiencing truly remarkable growth to its west.